Okay then. So I'm David Briggs. I'm the Vice President and New South Wales Division Chair of the Colour Society of Australia. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. The Colour Society of Australia is a 100% volunteer-run, not-for-profit organisation. We're the Australian member body of the International Colour Association, or AIC, and this event continues a series of webinars we've been putting on for free for the last 2.5 years. So it's my pleasure to hand over to our past president, John Pretorius, who's going to introduce our speaker, Ulysses Jackson. John is muted at the moment.
Thank you, David. Well, thanks very much for starting us off, and thank you everyone for taking the time today to attend this webinar. And of course, a special thanks to our international attendees. First and foremost, Ulysses himself, who's I think it's about 9 o'clock in the evening, East Coast time, and many others of you are also joining this in different time zones, so I'd like to thank you for that. So just before I introduce Ulysses, I just wanted to thank Veronica Colvin for her efforts to get this presentation, and in fact, this series off the ground. I was off for many weeks trekking in Nepal, and just every now and then managed to get some internet, and saw that she was really working on getting it all organized. And I'd also like to thank David for his support. Now back to this webinar. As an artist, but also as someone with a really big curiosity about pigments and paints, I think I found myself circling back to questions about coatings and paints at very many stages in my development. So, right in the beginning, as a beginner artist, you might just want to be able to read the tube properly, understand what's said on the tube and what it means for what you would like to do. Later on, as you develop your own palette, and you've got various views and experiments that you want to do, you want to understand the pigments better. You might be interested in how they ground, whether you can make your own paint, what the binders are, all this sort of stuff. So, while this is very much meant to be a broad introduction, we recognize that artists at all stages in their careers have an interest in how paint works, how pigments work, and how it affects their practice. So this brings us to Ulysses Jackson from Golden Paints. He's someone who's thought about these issues for very many years, both as a practicing artist, but also with his professional work at Golden. I've had the pleasure of working with Ulysses professionally when Werner Dietrich and I helped Golden develop their virtual paint mixer. So, people say this, but it's literal truth. Ulysses has forgotten more about pigments and paints than I will ever learn in my life. So I think we're really fortunate to have you here today, Ulysses. I thought I knew your work quite well as chief research R&D person at Golden. And also as the person who's the main formulator at Golden. But I didn't realize, of course, that you also owned a patent in QoR Watercolor. So I think you mentioned you might refer to that towards the end. In any case, look, thank you very much for taking the time. I'll leave the space to you now to start the presentation. Generally speaking, we're hoping that this would go roughly for an hour, and then there'd be some question time. We prefer to let the speaker go. So if you want to put questions in the chat, you'd be very, very welcome. And obviously we'll try and make sure that we circle around to all the questions that you might have in your mind. Thanks again, and over to you, Ulysses.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much for that introduction. And it's thrilling to be here with you for me tonight in your morning or wherever you may be. So let me start this presentation, and if someone could just let me know if they can see my screen currently. All right, excellent, perfect. So what I will say is this is a very broad topic. and general introduction. There's many books written on the subject. I hope that I have that both exciting enough for people who know something and general enough for people who don't. So first, I'll barely talk about our company. We were founded in 1980 as a retirement project by our founder, Sam Golden, who was told by his wife, just get out in that barn and make some paint. And so he and his son, Mark Golden, started Golden Artist Colors in 1980 in a 900 square foot barn. We started working with artists in the city, hand delivering paint down to the city, asking artists to try it. If they like it, please buy someone, tell stores to carry it. And if they didn't like it, tell us what they didn't like and we'd make it better. So it's always fun to see Mark there, and the buy art, not cocaine is a great motto. Now we've grown a lot. So here's a view of our facility with our residency across the street, as well as another warehouse space. And we have about 145,000 square feet, 265 employees. We're sold all over the world in 60 plus nations, and we have our multiple brands we service. Okay, so here's a shot of my office wall, and let's get into the nerd stuff. So making paint is a bucket of compromises. We have a lot of decisions to make when we're designing a coating for our niche industry, and each one has to be balanced, right? So I could make a fantastic paint that was just too expensive for the market, or I can make a paint that also had environmental concerns, but it performed very well. So we're always trying, when we design our products, to take all of these aspects into consideration and balance as best we can for our end goal. Binders are really important. So in a paint, what's a binder? Simply stated, it's the stuff that holds the stuff. And if we go to Wikipedia, it's not that much more in depth. A binder or binding agent is any material or substance that holds or draws other materials together to form a cohesive whole mechanically, chemically, by adhesion or cohesion, which means you can really use anything that is thin and wet to start with, and then it somehow cures or quote unquote dries, and it gets very viscous. So you can think of paint drying as just getting infinitely thick in viscosity. So binders, the things that stick stuff together, have two key aspects. They are cohesion, which is the force that it holds itself together. And so that chewing gum on the left side is one of those worst experiences you can have, but it's a really good example of a binder with good adhesion. So it's sticking both to the cement and the shoe, but it has really poor cohesion, and it's stretching and tearing apart as a binder. Where on the right side, the epoxy glue, a two-component epoxy, had very good adhesion and cohesion to the point where it actually broke the wood apart. And so depending on your goal, you can balance those forces to satisfy a particular need. Binders come in two main categories. There's lots of subcategories, but to keep it simple, you have thermoplastic and thermoset. And a thermoplastic binder is soluble in solvents. It has a melting point called a TG, or a glass transition temperature, and they cure generally by coalescence. Thermosets are resistant to solvent. They are kind of a one-way street. So if you heat them instead of melting, they'll typically decompose, and they cure somehow chemically. So some different examples that most of us probably know. So on the thermoplastic side, I can point out, gum arabic used in watercolors, PVA used in like Elmer's glue, and then standard acrylics like the ones Golden make. Or even wax would be a really good example of thermoplastic. On the thermoset side, it's something like artist oil paint is a really fantastic classical example of a thermoset because it cures by oxidation. Or cement, or something like that would be thermoset or 2-component epoxy. So let's go way back in time to the caves, right? So really early humans were painting in the caves, and they, would use their binder would be, it seems like animal fat was typically used. The pigments were sometimes berries and clay. The berries, of course, would decompose to brown over time. But what's really interesting about these cave paintings is that over time, the limestone flowed down, covering it. And so it became a thermoset coating by just nature, curing it to make it part of the rock, which is just interesting. So moving a little forward in time, we'll talk about oil paint, right? So oil paint could be any sort of vegetable oil that has some drying quality. So on the screen, I just have walnuts, flaxseed or linseed, and safflower. And then at the top, you have an example of a triglyceride. You don't need to know chemistry to really understand that the area with the double bonds. So I'm hoping people can see my cursor. So like at number 9, 12, and 15 here, these double bonds are points of desaturation, which means they are active and they can cure with oxygen to another one of these fatty acids on this triglyceride that would have a double bond. So if you can imagine, in a drying oil, you have lots of these triglycerides floating around. Oxygen comes in, it opens up one of these bonds, and it does it on another one, and they start to cure together to cross-link and dry that paint film, because as they cross-link, the polymer chain grows, it gets much thicker in viscosity, and at a certain point, you form a three-dimensional network that locks it in place permanently. So oil paint can be actually as simple as taking a drying oil, adding it to a pigment, or in a formulated paint, you add some other stuff, and then milling it somehow. So for an artist who is interested in making paint for themselves, it could be a really great place to start, because if you're making it and using it right away, you don't have to worry about any of the issues of long-term stability that a formulated paint would, and you could make something that would be just fun to experiment with. So all you need is really a spatula or some pigment and some oil for the most bare bones test. We in manufacturing generally use refined linseed oil. And so for time's sake, I'm not going to go through this graph completely, but we do have on our justpaint.org website a really good article on refining it. But the two parts I'm going to say is that is alkali refined, which gets rid of a bunch of the stuff that could cause yellowing. But one of those things, the fatty acids, the free fatty acids, they need to add a little bit back in because it really helps with pigment wetting. And so when you're buying an alkali refined linseed oil as a manufacturer, you actually specify your acid value for the goal you're after. So when you're formulating oil paint, you first need to figure out how much pigment you can put in to stabilize. And each pigment has its own absorption value. So this is basically dealing with the surface area and porosity of pigments. And you want to first figure out just how much oil coats that pigment. And then that can tell you, your maximum pigment loading in a paint, as well as it could tell you some more for other paint systems as well. So if I had an unknown pigment come into our lab, this would be the first test we'd do. So you can certainly watch a YouTube video on it, but it's basically you take a weighed amount of pigment, you add linseed oil drop-wise until you get something that's kind of like taffy. It just barely holds together and it's really stiff and unusable. This would be a terminal oil absorption value that then we could either use to say what other pigment is this going to perform similar to and start our formulation based on that. Or we could even look to another system. So we would say, oh, this pigment is similar to cobalt blue. What did we do in acrylic for cobalt blue? Because they should have a similar need for binder demand. Then if you took a pigment at this level of oil absorption and you add a tiny bit more oil, what will happen is it will actually start to space out those pigment particles and give lubricity, which allows the paint to flow, and you actually have a functional oil paint. So generally a maximally pigmented oil paint will be right at the oil absorption with just enough excess oil to allow it to flow nicely, and then just enough stabilizer to hold that excess oil in place so you don't get separation in the tube. So to do that, you use some other additives, and this varies dramatically by manufacturer. So for professional artist oils, you're typically trying to maximize your tint strength, right? And to get your tint, you basically need as much pigment as possible. And so you're not trying to add anything in excess because it would reduce that tint strength. But some companies who are doing things for cost reduction or student grade paint, they'll use as much filler as possible to figure out that cost to price ratio. I'm thrilled to work for a company that is not interested in that side. We want to maximize pigment load as much as possible. Common additives that can be used would be a natural wax like beeswax. There's hydrogenated castor wax and aluminum stearate. Those three are basically used to gel that excess oil and keep it in the formulation so it doesn't separate out in long-term storage. The Blanc Fix, marble dust, and other solids would be used either to shorten up a very stringy paint, so like if ultramarine blue is just made with just oil and pigment, it's almost unusable because it's so stringy and very flowing. And so you might use just a tiny bit of some of those materials to get it to where it's a nice, buttery, good feeling paint, usually in the least amount possible. And then other solids, which that list could be quite broad depending on if you want a textural effects or something like that. Pigment categories. So once again, all of this is very simplified, but so you have inorganic pigments made of rocks and minerals. So that would be any of the metal sounding pigments, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, chromium oxide. Then you have organic pigments, which are made of carbon chemistry. And I love this, this graphic of the organic table, organic periodic table, right? So those are the elements that when we're doing organic chemistry, we focus on. The rest of the stuff kind of gets in the way. And then you have organometallics, which we classify with the organics, but they do have a single metal ion in the middle. So something like phthalo blue would be a classical example of that. And this is actually from a different presentation, but when I was preparing this, I saw it and I just love the concepts that so much of our invention has been by accident. And so, it's really funny to me that the Prussian blue was discovered by accident, trying to make cochineal dye, but having some blood contaminating their alkali. So always funny on that side. Some other synthetic organic pigments, many of which in oil paint, all of these would wet out very easily and similarly. In water-based paint, the inorganics do wet out very easily because they have oxygen and sulfur groups on the outside that likes water, but they might be more difficult to stabilize because something like yellow iron oxide or Viridian green have their own challenges. Like Viridian green wouldn't be stable in a high pH environment, and yellow iron oxide doesn't play nice with other ingredients, and it wants to make your paint kind of jelly-like. Right now, there's a market. Most of the pigment research in the market is on special effects pigments. They're widely used in automotive and aerospace. So there's a lot of research dollars behind them. And they're all based on platysolids with different levels of coatings that bounce or refract the light. So this is just a graphic that shows basically how interference colors work based on the thickness of titanium dioxide or titanium white, but it's put onto a mica shell so thin that they can control how it bends the light. Yeah, so this is a SEM, a scanning electron microscope image of one of those special effects pigments showing that thickness of the coating on the side of the mica flake in the middle. They play pretty nicely in paint, but they have a very planar surface, so they want to clump together and kind of you have to balance your loading and feel under the brush. Generally, they need a little extra oil. Organic pigments, the ones made out of carbon chemistry, are made from organic molecules. We'll show a little bit more on that in a second. They're a pigment versus a dye. A pigment is not soluble in the solvent typically used in the paint when it's supplied. It will have much better light fastness than dyes, because if you think about a dye as kind of a single molecule, where a pigment is a crystalline structure, a cristobalite of dye-like molecules, but it's more boulder-like. So if the dye was pea gravel and UV energy was a hammer, the hammer would hit that dye and break that into dust, and you would no longer have pea gravel. But if that same hammer hit a boulder, it might bounce off and not cause damage, right? So that's kind of, dyes are more like pea gravel, and pigments are more like boulders. And they tend to have a much higher tint strength than the inorganic pigments, mainly because they are small in particle size, more approaching that dye-like kind of tint strength. So when we're talking about organic pigments, we're usually referring to the backbone of the pigment. So here's just some very typical classes with their chemistry structure. So quinacridone would just have this generic structure. And you can think of these as kind of like a flower pot that then flowers, functional groups are tacked onto, and that changes the actual color quality. So all quinacridone pigments, whether it's quin magenta or quin violet, they all have kind of the same initial shape. And then I'll show how the substitutions are a little different. All pigments are based around naphthalene, which is the same core structure that like a mothball would be made out of. So something like naphthol red light, PR122, which we'll show in a second, in that family. And then you have the azo family, which is a huge class of pigments based on this nitrogen linkage here. And this one is benzimidazolone yellow light, which is just a really beautiful light value color. And they're all made in a chemistry lab from precursors, other chemicals made by other chemical factories on a large scale, not by my company, although I wish. Usually, the vast majority are made in India and China, with some manufacture in the US and elsewhere. This is a page from one of my favorite books, The Industrial Organic Pigments. And it shows you, in this case, we have our quinacridone backbone, and then these different positions. You can see R1, 2, etc. And then below you have one of our pigment ID values that we all know. And so this one, PV19, which would be quin red or quin violet. You can see it's just in all those positions would be hydrogen all the way across, where quin magenta, PR122, would have just two positions where they had a methyl group, a little extra carbon in the place. That both changes the color, which is important to the artist, but they also play very differently with the different ingredients we have in our coatings. And so we need to be aware of what we're working with. So we look at graphs like this quite frequently to try to figure out what might be going on. I always like to talk about carbon black because it's one of those funny ones, right? So organic pigments are made of carbon, but is carbon black organic or inorganic? And so there's a simple test. If it would burn, it would be organic. And because you can't burn carbon black, it's basically already burnt. It is a inorganic pigment. And this is in our lab, we have a meme wall because I find chemistry funny. And fortunately, a lot of my team does as well. And so I always love this little meme where you have a plastic dinosaur. It opens up a chemistry textbook, it's reading about plastic, and it gets really emotional because it realizes it's a real dinosaur after all, because all plastic is made from fossil fuels. Which brings us into water-based paint, right? So water-based paint you can make for short-term use very easily. So artists could definitely make their own water-based paint for kind of immediate use. But I have a team of people who work on these projects every day to make sure that the paint will last and function in the way we would expect for more consistent use. So it could be as simple as taking a pigment, wetting it out somehow with water and some surfactants. We'll talk about this more later, and then grinding that dispersion with something like a molar. And then finally, if you have a nice dispersion, you would add a binder to it. In this image, we have GAC 100, which is a kind of a generic acrylic binder that's kind of soft and flexible. When we're thinking about binders, we're always trying to determine what our end goal is. And so we first start thinking about monomers. So you can think of monomers like Legos. And I have acrylic acid that's widely used in chemical thickeners, and its main use in industry is actually the absorptive material in baby diapers is polyacrylic acid. So when we're thinking about our binders, we'll work with a polymer manufacturer and specify what functional properties we want. So methyl methacrylate is a very widely used binder. It is basically plexiglass. So a sheet of plexiglass would be polymethyl methacrylate. Butyl acrylate is sticky note, super soft and sticky. If we made a paint out of only methyl methacrylate, it would be super brittle. If you tried to roll your canvas, it would just shatter. And then vice versa, if we did only butyl acrylate, it would be sticky. And if the cat walked by, it'd be stuck in your painting and not a happy kitty. So we'll work with the polymer manufacturer, and they'll blend these Legos, these monomers together in proportions to make something with a final TG or hardness, that glass transition temperature of what we desire in our coating. So we're usually thinking about the pigment we're using, how that will affect the hardness of the film, the studio conditions or the functional environment that coating will go. So if I was designing something for a hard enamel for furniture versus an artist paint, we would have very different kind of binder concepts. And they'll pop that off by initiating the reaction with a free radical and get a polymer. So this would be a polymethacrylate polymer. So you have lots of the monomers linked together. And I always find it funny that someone like Philip Glass makes his music and draws it the same way chemists draw polymers, right? So you have that monomer, and you would just say, okay, here's a chain of 4 of those. And Philip Glass has, musical notes that says, play this 8 times, right? So not that different. Here would be some different polymers from different manufacturers exposed to UV energy. So we have our unexposed, what we call hockey pucks, and this would be exposed. And you can see out of all of these, you really only have one clear winner, which is this one that did pretty great. This one is kind of nice, except you can see it slumped and was melting. So that would cause other issues later. So we start with a binder because it's going to give you your gloss of your paint. It's going to really control the hardness, the flexibility, chemical resistance, all of those aspects. And because that hardness, we have to think about the coalescence of the film, right? Sometimes we'll use a binder that's transition temperature is above the room temperature in which it's going to be curing. Those polymer spheres are floating around in that aqueous dispersion. The water leaves, they kind of cluster together. Then they start to slowly deform as if they're like soccer balls deflating into a honeycomb shape. Finally, those edges kind of diffuse, giving you that quote unquote dry film, or the first stages of dry film. It actually takes multiple years for a standard paint film to fully cure. And then finally, after it's had some aging, it shrinks completely down and you have that final cured film. So if you're using a binder that's too hard for the conditions, you'll get this cracking effect, which would be a really bad day at the office. And you can add something called a coalescing agent, a slow evaporating material, and suppress that TG temporarily and get a nice film to form. And then that coalescent will leave and you'll get your final properties a little later. Surfactants are big in our world. Surfactant means surface active ingredient. And the most general example of one would be something that has a hydrophobic tail, so afraid of water, and a hydrophilic head, something that loves water. And you can think of this as like a relationship counselor for oil and water mixtures, right? So many of the solids, like those polymer chains, are hydrophobic, so they don't want to be in water, but the hydrophilic head can attach to the water side and the hydrophobic tail can attach to the polymer, and then it can form a stable structure that I'll show you in a second. Surfactants move from areas of high concentration to low concentration. So basically when you're adding them into your system, they're diffusing out, kind of like when the marathon runners get going. And it's really important to know if you're doing layering, that it can affect things if you have, say, too high of a concentration below another coating. That can cause some complications. So let's look at some examples of pigments. So here we have ultramarine blue, which is fairly friendly to water. So you can see here when we add some water, it just goes right into a really, low quality dispersion. And then now let's look at naphthol red light, PR112, that hates water. And you can see as the water is added, it just does not go in and the pigment's jumping up on top of it. So here's a more detailed example where we can see just the water is still water and the pigment kicked it off and it doesn't want to go in. So now we're going to add a drop of surfactant and watch it just bring that hydrophobic pigment in. So it's now that water has that concentration of surfactant. It's a higher concentration in the water, and the hydrophobic portion wants to get away from the water, so it's grabbing onto that hydrophobic pigment and pulling it with it into the water until you get nice micelle structures, right? So here we have our surfactant model again, the simple model of the hydrophobic tail and the hydrophilic head. And in the center, we would have that pigment particle or polymer particle, and this micelle would be all of those structures surrounding it. And that forms a stable structure in the dispersion and keeps things floating around. So when we get pigments, they come agglomerated like a cluster of grapes. We start dispersing them with a disperser, and then it becomes single primary particles. To do that, we first use wetting agents, which are very low molecular weight surfactants that go in quickly and break apart the structures, allowing the milling to occur. So I like to call them ninja surfactants. And then we have dispersants, which are larger molecular weight surfactants that act as like bouncers or spacers that lumber in to those new interfaces and hold things apart. So we generally will make our dispersion and then we'll mill it on a different, either 3-roll mill or basket mill. And that will give the primary particle, which will give you the strongest tint strength because the pigment particles are spread furthest apart. And then you'll stabilize that dispersion using your surfactant package. Some milling equipment can actually overmill pigments, and that can affect light fastness. If you grind an organic pigment past its initial primary particle, you've now made those crystals smaller, and you can see a drop off in light fastness. So surfactants are great. So why not add a lot of them? And the reason is if you add too much, you get foam, right? So here we've run out of solids, and you can see the surfactants formed a double layer, an air bubble, which could be a real hassle. So to combat that, we're trying to always balance our surfactant load, but also we add things called defoamers that are like molecular needles that come in and disrupt that micelle, much like that finger is rupturing that ball. It allows the air to come out, bubbles to come together, and to leave the system. And then we also use de-aeration equipment. And then finally, with water-based paint, what's interesting is they all start as a low viscosity system, and then we use chemical thickeners to thicken them up. So the different classes are generally a cellulosic thickener. So you can think of dissolved cellulose is like wood or cotton or something along those lines. They dissolve it really fine, and then add functional groups onto that allow it to swell in an alkaline environment. And so this is very similar to when you're making like Chinese food and you have cornstarch and water and you mix it in with your food and you heat it, or making gravy. And then that will increase in viscosity when the heat activates it. The cellulosic thickeners kind of are similar, but they do it when a high pH activates it. On the other side, you have acrylic acid thickeners, going back to our absorptive material in the baby diaper. There are certain classes of acrylic acid thickeners used in water-based coatings that also swell or associate with a high pH system, allowing us to dial in with a very small amount of rheology modifier thickener to the inconsistency that an artist would like, whether that's an ink-like consistency like our high flow acrylics, or up to something like extra heavy gel matte that's a really thick paste. In a typical waterborne paint, there's a lot of ingredients that we have in there for many different goals, right? And I like to think of each one as a personality. And so, you know, they all have to get together and function well. So here's just kind of a list of the typical things that would be in a water-based paint. It's usually right around 12 to 16 ingredients that each one has to play nice together. And since my company has a lifetime replacement guarantee, it means that we have to assure shelf stability, which we actually do with accelerated aging. So I always like to say, like, if you have a group of people and they're getting along great, and you put them into a room, you close all the doors and you turn up the temperature as high as it could go, and you left them in there for a month. At the end of the month, they'd either be best friends, they made it through, they're friends for life, or they'd hate each other's guts. And the same is true for paint. If all those ingredients get together in a month at 60°C, we know it's going to be good as ever, you know, for the foreseeable future, and vice versa. If something is not playing nice, we'll see that. And we do a lot of iterations. The lab and I did 7,000 trials last year of different paint projects. On the other side, we also need to assure for freeze thaw stability. And so we have a freezer where we freeze paint solid, we let it thaw, and we repeat that 5 cycles for everything we develop. When we're picking pigments, light fastness is really important for artists, right? So any pigments used for other industry where it's less important, right? So if you have a printed catalog, that's functional life is basically to be shipped to the consumer. They'll look through it. It should be really pretty when they look through it, but then it's time to either be recycled or disposed of. So to make the pigment in there last hundreds of years would be a waste of the technology, and it might be more economical to use something that degrades faster. But in our industry, we're thinking functional lives of many hundreds of years. And so we have exposure chambers. Xenon arc is one we use a lot, and this image is from a xenon arc chamber, where it's like an easy bake oven on steroids. So you can put these two, I have 2 greens here, and these greens are mixed with the same amount of white paint. And then this bottom portion, this little snip, was exposed. And you can see this one on the right side had very little change in the equivalent of 100 years of museum lit condition. And this one had dramatic loss of yellow. So in our directions, we would of course not pursue that yellow. We would pursue the more stable yellow, which in this case, the stable yellow is benzimidazolone yellow light, that PY175 shown earlier. Other things we have to look out for are all of the squirrely effects that artists would not want to see. So this top left corner is an example of surfactant bloom. So on the left side here, there's this nice jet black coating. That would be our standard. This is made out of a dispersion that another company said, why are you making your own carbon black dispersion? Use ours. It will be, way easier for you. And you can see that after a few months, it bloomed with excess surfactant coming out. So that surfactant stabilizes the water-based paint while it's wet, but then it kicks out as the paint cures because it's no longer needed, and those hydrophobic tails can come out of the surface. Here, you're testing chemical sensitivities. So this test here, there's a water drop left on the surface, and you can see this coating on the right blistered off. This coating on the left had no damage and very little sensitivity here with the chemical sensitivity, ammonium water. This one has a little more. Happy to say this is our paint and this is someone else's. Down here, we're looking at a spray coating. So this is a test we call the greasy hand test. So the operator would actually have a controlled grease. It's like a dilute grease, synthetic grease that you put on your hand and press on the cards. And it's on both these cards. And then we spray over it. And you can see this one coated over that fine, and this one shows the hand. So if an artist was working with an airbrush and they handled their canvas, if we provided this coating, then they would get that ghost, which most wouldn't want. Someone would really want it, and that's why we have a custom lab. And then this one is looking at surface energy differences. So this would be the red iron oxide, the PR 101 coating underneath was wet. And while it was still wet, we drew another thinner white coating over top. And we can see these kind of lava lamp patterns forming where the surface energy is reduced underneath. And so it's pushing off the paint over top or crawling. So we have to look out for that inner layering. Wanted to touch about watercolor because a lot of artists use it. So almost all of the stuff we were talking about with the other water-based paint applies. You're still using some surfactants and dispersants, but predominantly you're also using a water-soluble binder. This is an example of an acacia tree with a large gum arabic tear that would be harvested. Natural materials like acacia are affected by the weather, and so you could have different constituents in that tree sap depending on how dry or wet it's been or how sunny, etc. In our watercolors, we use a synthetic binder for control, and the one we use is called Aquazol, which is poly-2-ethyl oxazoline. You can see its little polymer graphic up here. And why we used it was that it has really great film formation properties and conservation properties when used thickly. So for many watercolor artists who paint conventionally, where they might see the benefit is it's really clean and bright. It gives really bright, it doesn't have any brownness to it. Also in whites, some artists in watercolor really like the white, and ours is super crisp and white because of the synthetic. But in the film formation, it's quite remarkable. So these are drawdowns that were cast in 2016. So this would be 0.15 millimeter thick or 6 mils thick, cast in 2016. So the top row is nickel azo yellow, PY150. These are two well-known gum arabic watercolor brands, and this is the QoR Watercolor sitting on the wall at ambient conditions. And down here is also same two well-known watercolors, gum arabic based versus the Aquazol based QoR Watercolor. And so what this just tells me is with the fluctuations in temperature and humidity in a fairly controlled environment, any thick watercolor passage could be problematic with the traditional gum arabic, but the QoR Watercolor allows for that kind of expansion technique with that great film formation. Okay, so I just covered probably what would be covered in multiple college courses in a short period of time, and I would love to hear what people want to know more about.
So Ulysses, that was fantastic. First of all, thanks very much. I'm still processing, as I'm sure we all are, the massive information, and not just the information, but the implied information. There's already a number of questions in the chat, and I really think we should address that. One that occurred to me quite early on was if you're talking to a working artist, maybe possibly an oil painter, it seems to me that people that try and make their own paints would have one advantage above this, what sounds like a very impressive chemical laboratory sitting behind on your side, which is that they don't need to make paints for shelf life. They don't need many of these things that you need for increasing shelf life. And in fact, a lot of artists might have concerns that the additives that you put in that increase shelf life from a commercial point of view might have some detrimental influence on the longevity of the paint. So what are your thoughts about artists grinding their own pigments and making their own oil paints, and whether that really is an advantage from the longevity point of view, or potential advantage?
Well, it can go, it's a two-way street. So where it's an advantage is exactly what you stated, that you have full control over what's going in your product. Where it gets a little trickier is there's the variability on how much medium you're using. And so you might inadvertently set up a lean over fat scenario that could cause some challenges. And, it's also possible to actually, underbind your paint. And then you could see, as it dries, some dryness or embrittlement. So it's really, if someone's consistent with it, it's absolutely great. And there's a long historical precedent of oil painters used to make all their own paint for use. But the convenience and the consistency is why manufactured oil paints came into existence, right? So I think it's fantastic for any artist to have control over the materials and to either make their oil paint, find a manufacturer they trust, because our business is a lot about trust, or also modify their paint to suit their needs.
Well, I think that probably takes us straight into some of the questions. So I'm just going to go straight to the first one, and that I can see in the chat, which is how long does oil painting tubes remain in good usable condition? So what is the best way to extend the shelf life of oil paints in tubes? So presumably you've bought this, and you might, have bought a particularly valuable tube, or, not use it for a year or something, and you want to be see whether there's anything you can do apart from what the manufacturer has done to extend the shelf life.
Yeah, so oil paints cure by oxidation. So as long as that is an airtight system and you've expelled any air in your tube, it should keep pretty much indefinitely. So, keeping the threads really clean and clear is probably the place we see the most issues, is someone doesn't put the cap on correctly, and there's just a little airspace where air can come in and go. So as long as you're dutiful keeping your caps closed, and if you have plastic tubes, making sure to squeeze out any air before closing it, it should keep very well.
I guess that relates also to Veronica's question, because she was mentioning that she mixes her own oil paints with walnut oil, and then to put it in a pot to keep the air out. And the question is, how long will it last? Which I guess is partly a question about the walnut oil, but partly also just about the just the air contamination.
Yeah, in a pot or a cup, you're playing either with the permeability of the walls. So many plastics, even though they hold water quite well, they're still oxygen permeable. Mm-hmm. And so, going with something like a HDPE could certainly help. Glass is, of course, better. And then if you really want to extend the life, you could get a inert gas that's heavier than air. Some people sell cans of it, or welding supplies will sell you tanks, and you could just expel the air out. So there's I think there's a commercial product called Bloxygen. It's basically just argon in a can that you would just puff that into your container to expel oxygen out, fill it with an inert gas, and then that should extend life, shelf life as well.
And so some people try and slow down the oxidization just by putting the paints in the fridge for a while, but then that's got other potential impacts as well, depending on the paint you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a, we believe that food and paint shall never meet. And so I cannot comment on that practice unless you had a designated fridge. But chemical reactions go much slower at colder conditions, right? Yeah. So yeah. And some people also add something like clove oil, and I would not recommend that practice. That it will extend the life, slow down the drying, but it can go too far and have implications later.
So there's a general question which is which Ron Francis raised, and it's been a concern for a while now for oil painters across the world with safflower oil, because of the evidence of reliquefaction that in some paintings. But of course, safflower oil is often used partly, I guess, for cost reasons, and partly with the lighter pigments as well. So can you give a perspective on that from the Williamsburg point of view?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly minimize the use of safflower. We have a few specific colors where we have it. I think the sunflower was more of an issue, but I also think the reliquefaction has a lot to do with other aspects of the formulation as well. So we would probably never recommend to really slap on thick layers of a safflower containing color. And a lot of those reliquefaction issues did come with companies that were using it as their main binder, and artists were using it very thickly. So
right.
It's definitely a concern, and yeah, we're very pro linseed oil because of its proportion of desaturation just allows for a better three-dimensional network.
Right. Just sort of circling back to the artists doing working on their own paints, and not just thinking about the production of the paint, but actually the refinement of the linseed oil in this case. So I'm sure you're very familiar with Tad Spurgeon's book and his methods for doing these things with the artists on their own. And that's there's obviously been a lot of debate about these things in online forums. But if you could comment again. You've got this whole industrial process that you outlined there, and Tad offers something that seems intuitively very attractive, a relatively simple process is under direct control of the artist. What do you think about that?
I like, and Tad's a very nice person. We had him to the factory, and he ran a demo for us with his process. And I think it's one of those things where we don't have enough information, pro or con, to say. The alkali refined linseed oil is a very well-known process, and it offers us a very clean product that develops very low color on whites on drying. With at least our test batches of that method, which it was by no means refined, we didn't see the same lack of color. But once again, it was just a test. And I mean, personally, I also wonder, because the time frame he's reading books, salt and alkali were kind of wishy-washy terms at the time. So salt could have been something like sodium hydroxide, right? Which would be a caustic or alkali that could also offer some of the refinement that we're seeing. So whether it's sea salt versus a different type of salt is still a little up in the air for me personally. But I love people experimenting, and alchemy is amazing. So it's, it's home alchemy, and if it's bringing joy, I think go for it.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I guess it is a complicated issue because some people are very interested in the process itself, but for other people, it's a very, they really care about the longevity of the painting, and they obviously don't want to spend their entire lives just trying to work out how to make the paint. They want to paint. So it'd be interesting to be kept up to date on any further tests you do on that. Because quite often, I guess you're in a position to do things that the artist on their own, they don't have access to the testing technology.
Sure.
So there's I mean, so something that's quite popular is obviously adding marble dust and things like that to your oil. So quite often people might even prepare relatively transparent oil paint just with marble dust. Or they can add marble dust and oil to existing paints in some combination. Are there any tips in that regard, or warnings you'd want to give people to, or what to look out for when they try and do that to change the quality of their paint?
No, I mean, I think that within reason is a sound practice. Yeah, I mean, it's when you're adding a solid like that, you do have to counter with some medium. And if you go too far, you could have something that could amber later in time. So use your best judgment on what you're doing. Marble dust is going to be more white and opaque versus something like the barium sulfate. The Blanc Fix is closer to refractive index and will actually offer more transparency. But yeah, I think there's a long history of artists modifying their paints with those solids. And I like it when it's on the artist side, they're choosing to do it versus on the manufacturer side where it's generally done for a cost reason.
Right. We had another question here about surfactants or wetting agents. So it's again in the context of artists preparing their own paints, and if they're dealing with hydrophobic pigments, relatively safe, accessible materials that artists could use in their own studios for the wetting process.
That's interesting because it's so geographical, right? So in the States, we have some specialty supply stores where you can just buy surfactants for paint making. In the US, we can sell a custom product called Universal Dispersant, where we've already kind of done a balanced blend for the artist, ready to use. But I know in other parts of the world, it's much harder to find those things. So I would say for that particular question, it might be better for them to contact help@goldenpaints.com, and then we could answer that more nuanced for them, for what they're after.
Okay, so look, that's helpful. I think we can definitely cover a few more of these questions. So just before we go to this relationship between the cellulose and the acidity and the silver point, one more question on oil paints. Zinc oxide obviously has been it's been a hot topic in recent years in the context of oil paint. And quite often it seems that no matter what level you test it at, there's a problem. So that's basically Ron Francis' question to you is, has there been progress on finding a safe level of zinc oxide? Because obviously as an additive to when you're making the white paint, it does seem to have very positive properties, mechanical properties that it adds to the white paint. So taking it away is a loss from that point of view, at least in the initial formulation. But what's your current thinking and the Williamsburg thinking on this topic?
Yeah, so we continue to test downward ladders, and certainly a tiny bit of zinc improves the whiteness of a white. Our titanium zinc white is the whitest white we make in Williamsburg. If you're painting on panel thinly, that's probably okay. If you paint on anything flexible, I would be very nervous that you'll see premature embrittlement with any level of zinc. We've gone down as low recently of pretty extensive with 2%, and we saw pretty substantial embrittlement in aging. So definitely we put a warning on our zinc white now. Basically kind of use at your own risk for that reason. Is it a beautiful pigment that allows for a great translucency, and a little bit in white really helps the whiteness? Absolutely. But I would personally steer away from it.
Understood. So then I should probably go back slightly further up the chat, and there's a question from Catherine Allard to whether you could please expand on the relationship between cellulose and acidity in paint. I think you had a reference there somewhere in the presentation. And
oh, right. So the cellulose doesn't bring acidity. So when they're processing the cellulose, they dissolve it in acid first so that it breaks down that large chunk of whatever it may be. So say some cotton pulp. And then they react it to add some functional groups that allow it to swell in the way we want. And then they neutralize it to get rid of that. So by the time we get it back for our paint, it's a pH neutral material that then is added into the paint. And when it meets the higher pH, the alkalinity of the paint, it expands and swells and activates in that environment. So yeah, I really actually appreciate if that was ambiguous to clarify that it is not an acidic product itself.
Right.
Now, sometimes in paper, when they're doing like paper pulp process, that's very different because they're not cleaning it or they're not using a pH neutral system to start with. And so when you're buying your paper, you definitely want to make sure you have, you know, like an acid-free cotton rag, something like that.
Right. And then there was a slightly different question with a different focus regarding silver point. So obviously metal point, silver point in particular, has had a bit of a renaissance in the past, while lots of people are interested in that. And there's a ground for that that's already produced. And I guess
that was one of my first formulation projects many years ago. They thought I was crazy that who does silver point, and it was actually really kind of fun to see that a lot of people use it now.
Yeah, no, it's great. So I guess the question is, are you working on another one, or are you happy with the ground as it is?
I mean, the silver point artists seem happy, and in my industry, unless something's kind of broken, we don't want to touch it, you know. So unless, say, a raw material was changed or discontinued, we kind of let it do its thing. And like I say, most artists have reported back favorably on that one.
Right.
Yeah.
Look, the next question was one that definitely occurred to me, and I would have thought would occur to quite a few working artists along the way. There's this massive knowledge that, as I said, you either presented or included by reference. But how does it change how has it informed your studio practice? So what does it change about the way that you actually work?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. So I continued to be a professional painter for about a decade of my career with Golden. But then there are just challenges with the commercial side of it that kind of changed my focus. So while I was painting, it would be funny that my work would, you know, I'd be painting on a passage and I'd open up a container, and for all intents and purposes, it's fine. And, you know, it was fine paint, but I'd look at the batch code and then close it up and take it into work, and you know, it kind of would bleed over a little bit. It's tricky to keep the creative mind and the scientific mind separate. So I always struggled a bit with that. As I moved away from painting, I've moved into ceramics. And so that allows me to do a fair amount of chemistry, of glaze experimentation, clay body experimentation, but they're really just round objects that I'm painting an even thing on. It takes a lot of my personal quote unquote baggage out of it, you know, just kind of lets the kiln do the work. So that's where I am these days.
So does it, I mean, you're right, this is, you've got this tension between the analytic and the synthetic or the creative frame of mind. Does it help to separate it in time and say, look, yes, on Monday mornings, I'll think about the palette and the longevity of the pigments and, you know, how the paint flows and all this sort of stuff. And then I'll just put it aside, and for the rest of the week, I'm just going to paint, and I'm not going to try and, you know, trip myself up with the analytical thinking, or it's not that simple.
As for me, it's not that simple. No, I am always thinking about, oh, it'd be neat to make a new what have you, right? So yeah, the inventor side comes with me always. So,
well, look, I think we're almost winding up. There's probably time for a couple more. So just going back to the QoR watercolors, once they've painted and cured, I guess, if that's the correct word, are they still soluble in water? So if you spill water on it, does it redissolve, or how does it work?
Absolutely, right? So, you know, watercolors are supposed to be forever resoluble. Mm-hmm. So we tested with the accelerated UV to make sure that after the equivalent of 100 years exposure, it was still resoluble. So yeah, they function for all intents and purposes just like a standard watercolor with some added benefits.
Got you. Now, for those of us that are interested in light fastness, and specifically light fastness of synthetic organics, you know, there's quite a bit of discussion about the validity of earlier testing and some new testing that might be done on the ASTM light fastness. So Ron Francis raised that, and specifically is asking whether it's only golden and natural pigments that are conducting these newer tests for the synthetic organics, and how long we would have to wait for good results.
So we're working on getting another partner from industry. So, you know, I would say to anyone on this call who's interested in lobbying their favorite art material manufacturer to get involved with the ASTM effort, please do reach out to them and ask them if they are involved or could they be involved. So yes, the ASTM committee is doing great work, both with our partners in industry as well as the individual artists who join us. And to any of you who are out there, thank you. And any of you who want to become an ASTM member, please look into it. It's very economical, and we'd love to have you and talk about artist materials there. And currently, yes, I mean, Golden is doing a lot of testing in that regard, because we want to understand the standard, but also we're really focused on our products and want them to perform at the level we expect. So we've gone really deep into that, and hopefully in the near future have some more information we can share with artists around the world on our discoveries. So yeah, I would say the takeaway is lobby your favorite art manufacturer to join the ASTM artist committee, and let's all do some round robin testing so we can share our information with each other and just build that trust.
Well, I think probably that gets us close to wrapping up. One thing that did occur to me, Ulysses, maybe we can talk about it offline, is speaking on behalf of painters at various stages of development. It sounds to me like you'll have good knowledge of resources, a list of resources that relate to pigments and binders, and for all the different paints we covered. And it's the kind of thing that might be a useful takeaway for people attending. But let's chat about it afterwards, and maybe it'd be possible to put together a little list that we can distribute.
Sure, I'd love to. Yeah,
because we'll certainly post these talks and people can listen to them again. But a written resource a couple of years down the line, when you're stuck with something and you want to understand it better, would be fantastic as well. So look, thank you so much. That's been absolutely wonderful, and learned a lot. Specifically, you hear surprising things. When you're really surprised, you go, okay, I'm definitely learning something now. And that happened to me a couple of times in there. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for attending on, I mean, at least here in Canberra, it's good weather outside. You could have been outside in Australia on a public holiday, and instead you chose to broaden your horizons with pigments and paint making. So thank you, Ulysses, and thank you everyone.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for joining us. It was super fun.
See you again, I hope. Bye now.